Thank you so much. This was already quite rich and comprehensive. Let me move on quickly to Dr. Muhammad Zubair, who's as much of an academic. He might not agree with my statement here, as a PTM leader in disguise, actually, a kind of a thinker behind the scenes. He's the main author of PTM statute. If you don't know, PTM had launched a process of having a statute, and there are lots of debates around it. Anyhow, Dr. Zubair himself will touch upon that. And his online activities in the form of vlogs and blogs enjoy massive viewership and readership. Actually, he had a webinar yesterday with Ariana Aweja, which was a very interesting one. Over to you, Dr. Zubair.
Thank you very much, Dawood Malais, and thank you to the European Foundation for South Asian Studies for arranging this talk. And thank you for the panelists. I mean, after listening to Gulale and Ayaz Malik, there is not much left for me. I just have to say, Gulale mentioned quite a few times that it is the movement of the young. If the definition of young qualifies somebody like me who is young at heart, then I'm also part of the PTM. Gulale has given, in fact, Ayaz Malik's presentation. I mean, I agree with you, Dawood. I haven't read so far the best scholarly work on the PTM, and I'm so proud of you, Ayaz, for doing that. Thank you very much. It was really invigorating talk. As far as Gulale is concerned, Gulale has been in the trenches for a long time, and she knows better than me. She has a better pulse on what is going on the ground. And her presentation was also very comprehensive, especially when she talks about this. She made a very, very important point that I just want to re-emphasize once more, that the justification of the state violence on the bodies of the Pashtuns by the British colonial state, and after that, the Pakistani state, for achieving some strategic objectives, and for that matter, producing the production of the Pashtun as a brutish, savage, and uncivilized is extremely important to understand in the larger historical context. I will refer quickly, I'm skipping a lot of things that I had written, but I will refer to the more immediate political and historical context of the PTM to understand why it arose. The first point is that we have to understand that PTM, the rise of PTM is in times when there was almost total surrender of civilian institutions like the central and provincial legislature, executive, and judicial branches of the government to the military, the only one institution, the Pakistan Army, that has been called by many commentators as a creeping coup that has been going on for the last decade. Number two, the foreign policy of Pakistan has been the domain of the Pakistan Army, but in reference to the PTM, I will particularly refer to the military's foreign policy towards Afghanistan, what they call the strategic depth, seeking strategic depth into Afghanistan, which has been a bloody policy. It has resulted into a lot of blood, and especially the Pashtun blood. And this policy basically has entailed, the Pakistan Army supporting Taliban's in what we used to call the Federally Administered Tribal Areas in Afghanistan, making distinction between the good Talibans and the bad Talibans, making peace deals with these terrorist organizations, going against some and supporting others, and launching almost 17 military operations in the tribal areas that has resulted into a large-scale destruction. So what Malik was referring to, the concrete experiences within those. Now, just to refer to those experiences in one liner, I will refer to one of the clauses, the preamble of the draft PTM constitution that is being considered and debated upon, It says that, these gross human rights violations that were the result of this strategic depth policy and the military operations in the tribal areas has resulted into gross human rights violation against Pashtuns from across the Durand line, ranging from war crimes and crimes against humanity to extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, mass displacements, collective punishments, summary executions, physical and psychological torture, inhuman treatment, unlawful detention, and systematic large-scale punitive destruction of civilian infrastructure and economy. The third point that we have to keep, so it was in these circumstances that PTM came into being. The third point that we have to keep in mind is that, as I said, that all institutions have almost abdicated their constitutional role in favor of the army. In that context, the Pakistani parliament and other legislative bodies have enacted several draconian laws and constitutional amendments on the demand of the army. What we call collectively the corpus of the national security legislation, to which Gulare made a reference. These included oppressive laws like Action in Aid of Civil Power Regulation 2008 and Ordinance 2018, Defense of Pakistan Act 2014, and several other laws to which Gulale made a reference. These laws basically allowed military to have their own, to establish their own military courts, to establish internment centers, which are basically torture cells, and gave complete immunity to the armed forces from prosecution on account of the violation of human rights in the conduct of these 17 military operations that they have conducted so far. Just a few I mentioned, just to mention a few. And the fourth point that I want to keep in mind, want us to keep in mind to understand the context, is that the Pashtuns have two political parties, nationalist political parties. One, the Pashtunkhwa Milli Awami Party and the Awami National Party. So the Pashtuns have their nationalist political parties, but they were co-opted. Their leadership was basically co-opted by the state elites, which are dominated by one ethnic group, that is the Punjabi, what we call the Punjabi establishment. So as a result of that co-optation, they had to remain tight-lipped about Pakistan's what Pakistan Army was doing in the tribal areas of Pakistan and in Afghanistan, which resulted into all those crimes against humanity and all the stuff that I mentioned in the beginning. So we have to understand that it was in these circumstances that PTM arose and challenged the most formidable power within the state, that is the army, in ways it was never done before. What Ayaz has mentioned in his paper as the shock and awe technique that it was used. So it was extremely during these times. Now I agree with Ayaz that this slogan, like behind all terrorism is the army's uniform, that has been there for a very long time. But in the recent years, especially after the 9/11, it had become almost impossible for anybody to say that, given the power of the Pakistan Army. So in these circumstances, in this situation, I mean, this kind of slogans, the Benjaminian technique of shock and awe that Ayaz has mentioned was done by the PTM. And not only that it, again, making reference to Ayaz's paper, lifted the war curtain of fog and fear in Pashtun areas, but also enabled many other institutions and political groups to have that kind of courage. That is why we heard PTM slogans in the in the Pakistan bar councils and different bar council meetings, and most importantly in the rallies of the Muslim League Nawaz group, the largest political parties from Punjab, which is a conservative party and the most and the base where the Pakistan Army gets its most political support. Now, coming to, since a lot of stuff has been covered already, I will not go into what has already been talked about. I will restrict myself, being a constitutional scholar. My work relates to the constitutionalism and all that. So I will restrict my talk, the second half of my talk, to how the PTM has addressed the constitutional question in Pakistan. Now, as Gulalai said, that that the movement's demand were very simple. They asked for the most basic rights that gives basically justification for any state to exist in the first place, and that is the right to life, the right to dignity, the right to be treated in accordance with law, and the right to have the protection of the law. Now, these are the 4 articles within which all demands of the PTM fits into these 4 clauses of the Constitution of Pakistan. So on the one hand, it demanded, that we want these simple rights that your constitution. So by doing that, they have basically popularized what we call in constitutional law the idea of constitutionalism. That is that states and the different government institutions do not have unlimited power. That the power of the state and institutions is restricted by the fundamental rights of the citizens. Where my right starts there, the job of the legitimacy of the state power is basically dependent on the protection of the fundamental rights, not to violate it. So in that sense, PTM has popularized this abstract concept of constitutionalism, that is that the power of the state is restricted, it is not unlimited. Second point, the PTM's narrative has also redefined, or is in the process of redefining, the citizenship of Pashtun in their relation to the state. That's a very important point. For example, Manzoor Pashtun has repeatedly in his addresses argued on public forums that the only legitimate basis of the relationship between the state and its citizens has to be the constitution, which is reflective of the social contract. You remove the constitution from, now making a reference to the fact that the Pakistan Army has always trampled upon the constitution in treating the Pashtuns. In reference to that, he says that if you remove the constitution from the equation between the state and the Pashtuns, the only thing that is left is brute force. So force cannot be is not a stabilizing factor. It's not a legitimate relationship if it is based on force, because if you base the relationship on force between the state and the citizens, then it has to be maintained by force. And force cannot give rise to any kind of legitimate relationship or a right in the legal sense, right? Some kind of interest protected by law. That kind of a legitimate right cannot arise. The third point is that on the one hand, seeking the protection of the law and the constitution, at the same time, PTM has also questioned the legitimacy of the existing constitutional order. If you remember, Manzoor Pashtun was arrested the day when he made this statement. I mean, Pakistan Army was able to let go, these kinds of slogans, against the army and all that. But the moment he said that there is a problem with the constitution, because this constitution has a majoritarian system of democracy where one ethnic group, which has almost 70 of the population is controlling. So the whole system is designed in a way where the economic, political, and constitutional power is concentrated in the hands of one ethnic group to the exclusion of others. So when he questioned that, and he said that since this constitution also needs to be reviewed, to be revisited, and to be based on a social contract amongst the willing partners, different ethnic groups as partners. So when he made that demand, when he made a reference to that, the next day he was arrested. So that is another thing to which is very important that we have to keep. And since I was involved, just to make a clarification, I'm not the writer of the statute. In fact, I was involved in the process, which started somewhere in March 9, 2020, and it ended in July, which was basically a consultative process where we tried to bring together all these, the discourse of the PTM in a document so that, you know, it has its own constitution. So I was part of that, and it was I was part of that, and we had a discussion, a large discussion, in which, you know, at least these parts, you know, the objectives and the identity of the PTM and what it wants was the first part of that draft. There we also they also mentioned that when we talk about the new social contract, they said that there has to be certain principles. PTM basically asserted certain principles that would provide a basis for establishing the new social contract through a new social contract. And the PTM, for example, they said that it has to be admitted that the Pakistani society is a multinational, multicultural, multilingual in its character, that demographically it has highly disproportionate identity groups and nations, that the majoritarian democracy is in such a society establishes the permanent dictatorship of majority nation over all the minority nations, and that the genuine and inclusive democracy in a divided and multinational society like Pakistan needs reconceptualization and institutionalization of an anti-majoritarian model of democracy based on consensus and power sharing amongst groups and nations, coupled with the highly decentralized federal system that recognizes the first right of the people over their natural resources. So they basically also laid down what has to be the fundamental tenets of that social contract that is needed for the reformation of the state and for revisiting the constitutional order and coming up with the new one. The last point that I want to make is while coupled with the PTM's refusal to accept any relationship between the state and the citizens based on sheer force and the demand for the formation of a new social contract, PTM also has asserted the right of the nations to self-determination under the international law and the law of nature. So do I have a minute or two?
Yes, go on, no problem.
Okay, so I will just take a couple of more minutes. Now, all of this in regard to the constitution, position of the PTM on the constitutional questions, you will see that PTM's narrative and discourse has borrowed from a lot of historical resources. Since we are referring to different philosophers, I will refer to Jean Rousseau, the French philosopher, who writes in his social contract, one of the paragraphs that I will quickly refer to, and the importance of Rousseau is that he is considered the prophet of the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is basically a very important event that basically started the modern history of Europe, after which, you know, all the monarchies, one after the other, fell down and the new way of democracy came in. So he basically says that as long as a people is compelled to obey and obeys, it does well. As soon as it can shake off the yoke and shakes it off, it does still better. For regaining its liberty by the same right as took it away, either it is justified in resuming it, or there was no justification for those who took it away. So he says that the social order has to be based on legitimate basis, and force basically cannot be the basis of a legitimate relationship between the states. So you see that the narrative of the PTM borrows basically from these historical resources. And then I will also make a quick reference to the Declaration of Independence of 1976, in which basically serves as a justification for the American colonies to get independence from the British rule. So their basically argument was also this, that there are certain rights. We may disagree over the philosophically disagree over the nature of the rights, but they mentioned the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as some natural rights. And the job of the government and the state is to protect those rights. And if the state fails to protect those rights, that gives justification for the people to overthrow that government. Now, I'm not saying that the PTM is a secessionist movement or it has in its agenda, but just linking the two, the PTM's narrative is this, that, this relation has to be a legitimate one. It has to be based on willingness, consent, a social contract. And if state fails to perform its duties to protect the rights under that social contract of the Pashtuns, then they assert the right to self-determination. With that, I will end. Thank you.